in the autumn of 1415, King Henry V of England embarked upon one of the most audacious military campaigns in medieval history. Having assembled an invasion force of some 12,000 men, he laid siege to the port city of Harfleur in Normandy, a grueling enterprise that consumed his army's strength and resources. The siege dragged on for 5 weeks, and by the time Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's army had been devastated by disease, particularly dysentery, which swept through the camp like wildfire. Hundreds of men perished, and many more were too sick to continue. When Henry finally ordered his army to march, he had been reduced to perhaps 9,000 soldiers, including only about 1,000 men at arms and perhaps 5 to 6,000 archers, the remainder being support personnel. The objective was ambitious and dangerously optimistic. Henry intended to march across northern France to Calais, a distance of some 250 miles, demonstrating his right to the French crown and forcing the French to acknowledge his theme through either battle or submission. The march began in early October, and it was immediately beset by difficulties. The weather, which had been mild and pleasant during the siege, turned brutally cold and wet. Rain fell in sheets, turning the roads into quagmires. The English army, with its supply train and artillery, struggled through the mud, sometimes advancing no more than a few miles in a day. The men were drenched to the bone, their boots rotting, their armor rusting, their spirits steadily declining. Each night they camped in the open, huddled around meager fires, trying to dry their sodden clothing and equipment. The local population, fiercely loyal to the French crown, refused to sell them food, and what they could forage was scant. Henry had only taken supplies for 8 days, and they were already running dangerously low. The men were hungry, cold, wet, and thoroughly miserable, yet somehow Henry kept them moving forward. His charisma and iron will alone holding the army together through the most desperate of circumstances. The first major obstacle came at the crossing of the Somme River. Henry had planned to cross at the fort of Blanchetac, where his great grandfather Edward III had crossed before the Battle of Crecy in 1346. But the French had anticipated this and stationed a strong force to block his passage. Henry was forced to march upstream along the river's marshy banks, searching for another crossing point. The French shadowed his movement, always on the opposite bank, denying him every ford and bridge. This was a masterful delaying tactic, for while the English grew hungrier, wetter, and more exhausted with each passing day, the French were accumulating reinforcements. The situation grew so desperate that at one point Henry was forced to send envoys to negotiate terms, but the French magnates, flush with confidence, rejected his offers out of hand. They believed that time was on their side, and they were right. The English were trapped, hemmed in by the river on one side and the French army on the other, slowly being starved into submission. For 17 days, the English army trudged along the Somme, a distance of perhaps 40 miles as the crow flies, but much further as they wound along the river's banks. They crossed the river at last on October 19th through a ford that the French had failed to guard properly, but their relief was short lived. The French army was waiting for them, and the English had not eaten properly in days. Men were fainting from hunger and exhaustion. Even the horses were dying. The army was in a state of near collapse, and the French, who were well fed and well rested, knew it. They began to close in, shadowing the English march and preparing to strike. The climax came at the village of Maisoncelles on the night of October 24th, when the French army finally caught up with the English and blocked the road to Calais. Henry had no choice but to stand and fight. He drew up his army in battle formation on a slight rise, while the French took their positions opposite, their campfires blazing so brightly that the English could see them all night long, a constant reminder of their overwhelming numbers and confidence. The night of October 24th was perhaps the most miserable of the entire campaign. The rain poured down without pause, turning the fields into a morass of mud and filth. The English had no shelters. They had abandoned their tents to lighten their load during the march. They huddled in the woods, trying to find some cover from the relentless rain, their teeth chattering, their bodies shivering uncontrollably. Then the wind howled through the trees, cutting through their damp clothing like a knife. Some of the men had eaten nothing for 2 or 3 days. Others had tried to eat unripe fruit, which had only made them sicker. The mood was one of utter despair. Many of the men must have believed that they would never see England again. Yet, throughout this night of horror, Henry V remained calm and composed, moving among his men, offering encouragement, sharing what little food he had, and insisting that God would give them victory. The king's confidence, in the face of overwhelming disaster, was nothing short of miraculous, and it slowly began to infect his army. They had followed him across the sea, through the siege, and through this terrible march, they would follow him into battle. Kakapayat TWA. THE Farsi says CMBLE. When dawn broke on October 25th, the scene that greeted the English army was enough to make even the bravest men quail. The French army, as one chronicler put it, stood before them like a countless swarm of locusts, their ranks stretching from one horizon to the other. The exact numbers are disputed by historians to this day, but there can be no doubt that the French vastly outnumbered the English. Traditional accounts place the French army at between 25,000 and 30,000 men, while the English had no more than 6,000 effective fighting men, and some estimates are even lower. The French knights, gleaming in freshly polished armor, with their bright heraldic banners waving in the wind, presented a magnificent and terrifying spectacle. They were confident, boastful, and utterly certain of victory. The English, by contrast, were a sorry sight. Their armor was rusted and mud spattered, their clothing was filthy and torn. Many of the archers had cut away the lower portions of their trousers, which had become soiled during the long march, leaving their legs bare to the icy wind. The French army was divided into three main battle formations or battles, arranged one behind the other like waves about to crash upon the English shore. The vanguard, or first battle, consisted of the most prestigious and eager knights, including the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, the Marshal Jean Boucicaut, and the Duke of Orleans. These were the flower of French chivalry, men who had been born to war and were hungry for glory. Behind them stood the main battle, commanded by the Duke of Alençon, a proud and ambitious man who was determined to play a leading role in the victory. This battle contained the bulk of the French men at arms, perhaps 15,000 men or more, all encased in the finest armor that money could buy. The rear guard, or third battle, was a reserve force of perhaps 10,000 men, including many of the lesser lords and their retainers, as well as the crossbowmen and infantry who had been relegated to the rear. The French also had a powerful force of cavalry, perhaps 1,000 horsemen or more, who were intended to outflank the English and destroy the dreaded longbowmen who had been the bane of French armies for generations. Henry V, by contrast, had organized his army with the efficiency of a commander who understood that he could not afford to waste a single man. The English army was arranged in a single thin line, only four ranks deep, that stretched across the kilometer wide gap between two wooded areas. Henry himself commanded the center division, with the Duke of York commanding the right wing and Lord Camoys commanding the left. Each division consisted of a mixture of men at arms and archers, but it was the archers who were the key to Henry's strategy. The longbowmen, some 5,000 of them, were placed on the wings and in wedge shaped formations between the divisions where they could pour a devastating fire into the advancing French ranks. Henry had also adopted a novel defensive measure, one that was to prove crucial to the outcome of the battle. He ordered his archers to cut sharpened stakes from the surrounding woodland and to plant them in the ground in front of their positions, angled toward the enemy. These stakes would serve as a barrier against the French cavalry, impaling horses that charged too close. The archers were instructed to carry these stakes with them as they advanced, using them as a mobile fortress that could be set up wherever they chose to fight. The disparity between the two armies was not merely numerical. The English were exhausted, hungry, and sick. The French were fresh, well fed, and eager for battle. The English had marched more than 250 miles in 17 days through terrible weather. The French had been waiting for them in comfort, sleeping in warm beds and eating good food. The English were far from home, surrounded by enemies, with no hope of reinforcement. The French were fighting in their own country with the support of the local population. The English were heavily outnumbered, perhaps by as much as 3 or 4 to 1. The French had every material advantage. Yet, for all the French superiority in numbers, equipment, and condition, they had one fatal weakness. They were a feudal army composed of proud and quarrelsome nobles who would not take orders from anyone they considered their social inferior. The French command structure was a shambles, with dukes and counts arguing over precedence and refusing to follow the directions of the appointed commanders. The result was that the French army, for all its size, was a disorganized mob, more interested in personal glory than in military discipline. Fife part Teshari The Bataille began as for hour after hour. The two armies faced each other across the muddy field, neither willing to make the first move. Henry had hoped that the French would attack him, as they had every tactical reason to do so, but the French commanders, squabbling over the order of battle, seemed content to let the English starve and freeze where they stood. The English soldiers, already exhausted and hungry, began to lose hope. Rumors spread through the ranks that the French were dicing over the prisoners they would take, so certain were they of victory. It was a calculated move intended to demoralize the English, and it very nearly succeeded. As the morning wore on, the English mood grew darker and more desperate. Men who had marched across France, who had endured the siege of Harfleur and the terrible march along the Somme, now found themselves facing the very real prospect of death on a foreign field, far from home, with no hope of rescue or deliverance. Henry realized that he could wait no longer. His men were losing heart, and a demoralized army was a defeated army even before the first blow was struck. He gave the order for his army to advance, a decision of breathtaking audacity given his numerical inferiority. The English army began to move forward across the muddy field, their archers carrying their sharpened stakes, their men at arms marching in close formation, their banners streaming in the wind. The French watched in astonishment as the English came on, their morale perhaps shattered by the sheer nerve of an army that was outnumbered and outclassed but refused to accept defeat. Henry himself had dismounted and joined the fighting line, wearing his distinctive crown on his helmet so that all could see him. He ordered the baggage train to be brought up behind the army so that the soldiers could see that there was no retreat, no way back. They would win or they would die, and that knowledge stiffened their spines as nothing else could have done. When the English archers had advanced to within range of the French lines, they planted their stakes in the ground with a speed and precision that astounded the French observers. Sir Thomas Erpingham, the veteran commander of the archers, threw his baton into the air as the signal to begin firing. At that moment, history changed forever. 5,000 longbowmen, each capable of shooting 10 to 12 arrows per minute, began to pour a storm of steel and wood into the French ranks. The arrows rose in a great black cloud that blotted out the sun and then fell like a deadly rain on the heads of the French knights. The sound was like nothing that had ever been heard on a medieval battlefield, a continuous, deafening roar of bowstrings, punctuated by the screams of men and horses. The French cavalry, unable to outflank the English line because of the woods, attempted a frontal charge against the archers, but they rode directly into the arrow storm and were massacred. Horses screamed and reared, and knights tumbled from their saddles. The entire first wave of the French attack disintegrated in a matter of minutes. The French men at arms, however, were made of sterner stuff. Despite the arrows, despite the carnage, they advanced on foot toward the English line. Their armor so thick that most of the arrows bounced harmlessly off their plate metal. But the arrows had done their work. They had killed the horses and destroyed the cavalry. They had killed or wounded hundreds of infantrymen. And they had forced the French to advance through a killing ground that would have daunted the bravest of souls. The French knights struggled through the mud, their armor weighing them down, their shields raised against the rain of arrows, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The ground had been turned to a quagmire by the passage of thousands of men, and the mud was so thick that it could swallow a horse. Knights who fell could not rise again. They simply sank into the mire, sometimes drowning in inches of liquid mud. The archers, who had been firing for perhaps 10 minutes, had already launched more than 500,000 arrows, a feat of sustained effort that would have been impossible for any other soldiers in Europe. But they were English, and the longbow was their native weapon, a tool they had used since childhood, and their strength was legendary. Kaipipart, Feuard, Th. Limex, the French vanguard finally reached the English line, but they were a shadow of what they had been. Thousands of their comrades lay dead or dying in the mud behind them. They were exhausted, demoralized, and horribly compressed by the narrowing battlefield. The English men at arms, who had been waiting for this moment, met them with a ferocity that astonished even the French. The shock of the collision was felt throughout the entire English line, and for a few desperate minutes the outcome was in doubt. The French were still immensely superior in numbers, and they brought with them the weight of centuries of martial tradition. They pushed the English line back, and for a moment it seemed that the English might break. But Henry, his golden crown gleaming in the murky light, had stationed himself in the center of the line, and he refused to give ground. He fought like a common soldier, swinging his sword and warhammer, shouting encouragement to his men, his presence a tower of strength in the face of overwhelming odds. The French attack centered on the English right wing, where the Duke of York commanded. York, a seasoned veteran who had been a constant companion of Henry's throughout the campaign, led his men with courage and skill. The fighting there was the most savage of the entire battle, with French knights dying by the score and English soldiers giving ground but never breaking. Finally, York fell, killed by an axe blow that shattered his helmet, his cousin the king grieving his loss, even as he fought on against 100 enemies. But York's death had not been in vain, his division had held, and in holding it had bought the time that Henry needed to stabilize the line. The French attack, for all its fury, had failed to achieve a breakthrough. The English line held, and the French, exhausted and demoralized, began to lose heart. Now came the moment that won the battle for the English. The archers, who had been firing continuously from behind their stakes, realized that the French were no longer capable of mounting an effective charge. They dropped their bows, picked up their mullets, and charged into the French ranks. These were not knights or men at arms, they were common soldiers, many of them Welsh and English peasants, who had grown up with nothing but their wits and their bows. They were not wearing armor, they did not have swords or lances. All they had were the mullets they had used to hammer in their stakes and the knives they carried at their belts. But they were enraged and they were determined to avenge the comrades who had fallen. The French knights, heavy in their armor and already exhausted, could not defend themselves against these agile, half naked attackers, and the archers knocked them to the ground with their mallets and then stabbed them through the eye, slit up their helmets or the gap between their armor plates. It was a slaughter, not a battle, and the French, who had come to Agincourt in search of glory, found instead a hideous death. The fighting lasted for 3 hours, perhaps the longest and most brutal 3 hours in English military history. By the time the French finally broke, the field was covered with bodies. Thousands of French knights lay dead, and thousands more were taken prisoner. The English had lost perhaps 100 men, although even this number may be an exaggeration. It was an impossible, miraculous victory, and Henry V had won it against odds that would have daunted any commander in Europe. The French army, which had been so confident, so certain of victory, had been utterly destroyed. The flower of French chivalry lay rotting in the mud of Agincourt, and the road to Calais was open to the English. But the battle was not yet over. As Henry was surveying the field, he received word that the French had rallied and were attacking the baggage train in his rear. What he did in response was the most controversial decision of his reign. He ordered the execution of all the prisoners. Haki Part F5E THEFTRMATH. The order to execute the prisoners came as a shock to Henry's own men, who had expected to earn a fortune in ransoms from their captured French knights. Killing prisoners was against the laws of chivalry and a grievous sin in the eyes of the church. Yet Henry had no choice. He was vastly outnumbered, exhausted, and surrounded by enemies. If the French prisoners, still in their armor and heavily armed, took it into their heads to attack their captors, the English would be lost. Henry could not afford to take the risk, so he gave the order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His men, soldiers who had fought and bled alongside him, hesitated to obey. They had followed Henry through hell, but this was something else entirely. Eventually, however, the order was carried out, and hundreds of French prisoners, men who had survived the battlefield only to die at the hands of their captors, were put to death. It was a grim, ugly end to a day that had begun with such hope and fear. The execution of the prisoners had a profound effect on Henry V. He was a devout and pious man, and he knew that he had committed a terrible sin. He ordered 3 masses to be sung in thanksgiving for the victory, but he also ordered prayers for the souls of the dead. He may have felt that the victory had come at a terrible cost, not just in human life but in his own soul. Yet he could not afford to show weakness. He had to be strong for his men, who had endured so much and won so great a victory. He ordered his heralds to count the dead, and he was astounded by what they found. Among the French dead were the Duke of Alençon, the Constable of France, the Marshal Boucicaut, and thousands of other noblemen. The English dead were so few that Henry was initially inclined to disbelieve his own heralds. But it was true. The English had won a victory of such completeness that it was almost impossible to comprehend. The night after the battle was the most surreal of Henry's life. He stood in the rain, surrounded by thousands of dead bodies, and looked out across the battlefield. The French had lost the cream of their aristocracy in a single afternoon. The English, by contrast, had lost almost nothing of importance. It was the greatest English victory since Crecy, perhaps the greatest English victory ever. Yet Henry was not triumphant. He was haunted by the death of his friend the Duke of York, and he was deeply troubled by the execution of the prisoners. He may have wondered whether God had truly blessed him or merely given him a terrible responsibility that he would have to live with for the rest of his days. He knelt in the mud, his arms raised to heaven, and prayed for forgiveness, prayed for the dead, prayed for England, and for himself. He may have found some solace in the knowledge that he had done what he had to do, but it was a cold comfort. The day after the battle, Henry ordered his army to march again, this time toward Calais. The men, exhausted but elated, marched with renewed spirits, for they had won a victory that would be remembered for all time. The French, demoralized and defeated, made no attempt to stop them. Henry reached Calais on October 29th, 4 days after the battle, and he was greeted as a hero. The English soldiers who had survived the campaign were given a hero's welcome, and Henry himself was hailed as the greatest English king since King Arthur. He returned to England on November 16th, landing at Dover to the roar of cannons and the cheers of his people. The news of the victory had already reached London, and the city was in a state of frenzy. Henry had done what seemed impossible, and he had been rewarded with a victory that made him a legend in his own lifetime. Of Part 6, LGCAND. The Battle of Agincourt entered the English national consciousness almost immediately. It was not just a victory, it was a miracle, a sign that God favored the English cause. The story of the battle, of the outnumbered English army facing the flower of French chivalry and winning against impossible odds, became a cornerstone of English identity. It was retold in ballads and chronicles, and it was immortalized by William Shakespeare in his play Henry V, which is still performed to this day. The famous lines from the play, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," captured something of the spirit of the battle. The sense that the men who had fought at Agincourt were part of something special, something sacred. For centuries, Agincourt was the battle that English school children learned about, the victory that proved the superiority of English archers and English courage over the vaunted chivalry of France. Yet, the victory at Agincourt was not just a military triumph, it was also a political one. Henry V had won a victory that gave him almost unstoppable momentum in his campaign to claim the French crown. He returned to France in 1417 and 1418, systematically conquering Normandy and other parts of northern France. In 1420, he signed the Treaty of Troyes, which made him heir to the French throne and gave him control of much of France. He married Catherine of Valois, the French princess, and was recognized as the regent of France. It seemed that Henry V was on the verge of achieving what no English king had ever achieved, the conquest of France. But fate had other plans. Henry died of dysentery in 1422 at the age of 35, leaving his infant son to inherit a kingdom that was too large and too unstable to hold together. The English conquest of France collapsed, and by 1453, the English had been driven out of almost all of France. The legacy of Agincourt, however, lived on. It became a symbol of English courage and English ingenuity, a reminder that England, a small island nation, could face down larger and more powerful enemies if it had the will to fight. The battle inspired generations of Englishmen, from Elizabethan soldiers to Napoleonic sailors to Churchill's few in the Battle of Britain. The story of the English longbowmen, the mud at Agincourt, and the desperate courage of the English army became part of the national mythology, a story that was retold again and again in times of national crisis. It was, in many ways, the story that England told itself about itself, the story of the underdog, the small nation that refused to surrender, the brave few who stood against overwhelming odds and triumphed. The reality of Agincourt was more complex, of course. The battle was not a miracle. It was a triumph of planning, discipline, and the effective use of technology. Henry V was not just a brave warrior, he was a brilliant strategist and a ruthless commander who did not hesitate to do terrible things when they were necessary. The English longbowmen were not just common soldiers, they were professional warriors who had trained for years and who understood their weapon with a precision that amazed their opponents. The French were not just arrogant aristocrats, they were brave men who fought and died for their country, and they deserve our respect even in defeat. But the myth has endured, and it has shaped the way that English speaking people understand their history and themselves. In the end, Agincourt was a battle of the kind that happens once in a generation, a battle where one side wins an impossible victory against the most overwhelming odds. It was a battle that changed the course of history, but even more than that, it was a battle that captured the human imagination. The story of Agincourt is the story of courage and sacrifice, of the triumph of determination and discipline over arrogance and disorganization. It is a story that resonates with anyone who has ever faced impossible odds and refused to give up. It is a story that reminds us that human beings are capable of incredible things, even in the darkest of times, and that courage, skill, and leadership can overcome even the most overwhelming of enemies. That is why we still remember Agincourt, and that is why the story of the battle will continue to inspire people for as long as history is told.